Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good!
Oh, yeah? Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard.
Welcome in to another fresh episode of The Lager Line, as always served to you courtesy of Houston's Carbach Brewing. I'm Ben Dubose, your host, editor of USA Today's Rockets Wire, and contributor to Sports Talk 790, official flagship radio station of your Houston Rockets. Today I'm joined by Paulo Alves, my co-host and producer out of Portugal. You can follow him on social media at Paulo Alves NBA and me at Ben Dubose. So as we chat this Tuesday, July 29th, we're officially in the dead period of the NBA calendar. Summer League is over, free agency and trade season is mostly over, and now people around the league are going about their vacations, spending time with family and friends, before the grind truly begins with the opening of training camps around October 1st. We will have the NBA schedule released to look forward to in early August, and with the Rockets now having Kevin Durant on their roster and having legit championship aspirations, we're definitely going to have a lot to talk about once we get that schedule. But other than that, as far as breaking news, the pace will definitely be slower. Here on the pod, we'll try and compensate by having some interviews with some of your favorite Rockets media personalities, so stay tuned for some of that in the weeks ahead. Today, though, we're going to try to do a quick run-through of what's happened since we last recorded an episode in mid-July. Summer League is coming on, and the Rockets also made some moves around the margins with the signings of Josh Okogie to a fully guaranteed minimum contract and J.D. Davison and Isaiah Crawford to two-way deals. Okogie is a veteran defensive wing type player, clearly fits into the Ime Udoka culture in Houston, while Davison is a young point guard and Crawford a young small forward. Davison and Crawford mostly spent their time last season with the G League affiliates of the Boston Celtics and Sacramento Kings, and Davison was actually the G League MVP. We'll eventually discuss those roster moves and more, but I want to start our conversation today with actual basketball because, honestly, it's the last we'll see for at least a couple of months. The Rockets went just 1-4 out in Summer League, which really isn't that surprising when you look at the roster. It's just sort of the cycle of contention in the NBA. As your team gets closer to winning it all, eventually you bring in more veterans and you don't have as many high draft picks, and then you're not going to have the type of deep Summer League roster that the Rockets did and we had gotten accustomed to when they were rebuilding just a few years ago. But the one exception to that rule is Reed Sheppard, the second-year guard out of Kentucky, who the Rockets drafted at number 3 overall back in 2024. He's the one guy who was out on the floor in Las Vegas who very realistically could be playing real games for you next season. In fact, the current expectation is that he's going to be your backup point guard behind Fred VanVleet. And the numbers for Reed in Vegas, let's just be blunt, it wasn't ideal. He did average about 23 points and 4 steals per game, but it didn't come very efficiently, shooting about 36% overall and 32% from three-point range. He also averaged 4.5 turnovers to only 2.5 assists, not exactly the ratio that you're looking for out of a point guard. In terms of each game and the individual numbers, he was great in that first game against the Clippers, which they almost won, and then pretty bad in that second game when Detroit basically blew them out. Now, with that said, there are some huge caveats to that data. For starters, it's a ridiculously small sample. He played in just 2 games and honestly just 1 3/4 because he came out of the second one midway through the second half. He was dealing with a minor calf injury, which might have limited his mobility some, and then ultimately that led to them shutting Reed down entirely after just those first 2 games. And then the talent around him on that roster, let's be blunt and call a spade. It wasn't good. So teams were definitely able to load up against Reed in terms of how they defended because the Rockets just didn't have too many other guys who could create advantages or command much respect on the floor. So by and large, I think most of this is small sample size theater. It's nothing to get too high or too low about. But I do understand some of the fan anxiety that's out there because this is a season which for the first time in a while, you're entering with a realistic goal of winning a championship. And based on the projected rotation today, Reed Sheppard is the one and only guy who hasn't yet proven that he can be a consistently good rotation player in the NBA. So until he actually does it on a regular basis, it's fair to have at least some skepticism even with a guy who was drafted top 3 a year ago. And as far as Summer League, even after stating all of those caveats, the bottom line that I keep coming back to is this. For the most part, he didn't look like one of those guys who was clearly above the level of competition. If you remember back in 23, when Jabari Smith Jr. went down to Summer League before his second season, he was comically good. The Rockets shut him down after 2 games because there's basically nothing left to prove. He just clearly belonged at a higher level of competition. And then he immediately went out in a couple of months and was a good starter for Ime Udoka that next season on a pretty competent Rockets team that finished 41-41. With Reed, other than a few moments here or there, it just wasn't the same vibe. And that's not to say that it's an apples-to-apples comp. Obviously, Jabari is a much larger player at a different position. Also, Jabari in 23, he clearly had better teammates around him relative to Reed in 25. But we can throw out those types of caveats all day, and yet the bottom line is it just wasn't a great performance, and nothing's going to change that at this point. So, Paolo, I'll pass the baton to you. How do you contextualize what we saw in Summer League from Reed, both in terms of the good and bad of his play, and also if there's any predictive value from it?
Yeah, you obviously can't, it's 2 games, right? But it's not, it's kind of like the same thing that it was, well, it's a tough parallel to make, right? But it's a little bit of the same thing that we saw earlier on with Jalen's career, right? And I don't mean to compare the 2 players at all. I mean, in the sense that, yes, it's 2 games, but it's also 2 games that kind of reflect a little bit of what we've been seeing in the other games that he's played thus far. And to me, the things that are particularly worrying are he still can't really move laterally on the perimeter, right? He still gambles way too much. He'll get crazy steal and block stats, but it's your typical he just can't move laterally, so he has to gamble when defending. And I kind of wish he would have learned a little bit from Fred VanVleet, who also gambles a little bit, but can defend point of attack and be smart in his decisions, even though he's obviously not the best athlete. And then other than that, that's defensively, right? But then offensively, it just feels like he can't create separation at all. It's not really about knocking down shots. It's that the good game that he had was because during a stretch, he was just unconscious, making really tough shots, right? And that can work for you if you can't generate space, but you can knock down tough shots. That works, but that's a really hard strategy to make work, I guess. And so it's a combination of things. And then he had some silly turnovers, and then what felt like a little bit of an attitude that I didn't really like. Feel like he was, above this, which doesn't really strike me as his type of personality, because in every single, other context we've seen him, he's always been really humble and really team oriented. So it was really weird to see him, even that whole interaction with the referees where he was like, I'm clearly above this, why you're not respecting me, right? That was a little bit weird as well. And so not to say that Reed's a bust or anything, he's going to have, an important role, but still a backup role for this season, and he's still really young. It's just some things that are tough to project out, and he's really reliant on being an elite 3-point shooter and an elite mid-range shooter, because he's going to struggle to get to the rim anyways. So it really has to have that Chris Paul type of game for it to work out. And it just didn't look like it. He didn't look like he was, a tier above the other guys in Summer League. And yes, to be fair, Summer League is really muddied up basketball, which doesn't seem to be, his bread and butter. He's more of a structure type of player. And obviously Summer League is everything but that. So you can't really take too many long-term conclusions based on these 2 games. But then at the same time, this is the only basketball that we have watched in the last 2 months, and the only basketball that we're gonna watch in the next 3 months. So NBA season's really way too long. Yeah, but then other than that, I think Summer League was really meh. I will be honest with you, I could not bring myself to watch the rest of the games. Although, and I don't know if you want to use this to segue into our next segment, but I think I would have watched a few more Summer League games if we had JD Davison and what's his name? Isaiah Crawford. Yeah, I think I would have watched if we had those guys, because I know we'll get into it, but I'm pretty confident that at least one of those guys is going. I have pretty big plans for one of those guys long term, for what a two-way contract would, usually warrant.
Yeah, and we'll get to that as we make our way through today's pod. To your points on Reed's vibe, I think one thing that was pretty unique for Reed this year was that he was the only NBA caliber guy on that roster. Whereas in the past, Rockets summer league teams that we're accustomed to, like I mentioned, 2023 Jabari, who had Jabari, Tari, Amin, Cam Whitmore, that team was loaded. And most of the Rockets teams this decade have been with at least one or two NBA level prospects. Even last year, when it was starting to turn to a win now emphasis, it was Reed and Cam, and Reed was the rookie. So there was a lot more of a spotlight on him. For Reed as a year two guy to be basically the only viable NBA prospect on that team, I guess Kevon Harris could be a defensive wing in a pinch. He does have some NBA experience, but by and large, the Rockets did not have a roster featuring NBA players. And so I do think that puts Reed, with all the expectations that were on him coming out of Kentucky, it makes it a little bit of a weird spot for him. So I just wanted to clarify that on Reed and sort of his status and the whole pecking order in 25. I think it was a little bit of a weird vibe.
I can go, kind of both ways on this, right? I can say it's a 2-game sample size, and in these 2 games, he looked like the average 40-year-old, accountant that I see playing in my local park. But at the same time, I can go the other way and say, well, if we're talking about 2-game samples, let's look at, across last season, well, his only season, Reed had 3 games where he played over 30 minutes, right? And 3 games in which, he was tasked to have a volume role where he could really set the table for other guys and for himself, right? And out of those 3 games, you have game 81 against the Lakers, which I'm going to just throw out. Then you have 2 other games. You have LEC game number 80, which I guess you could throw out as well, but for agenda purposes, I'm not going to. And you have the other over 30 minutes game is the OKC game that everybody remembers. And in these 2 games, he's shooting like 7 of 14 in 10 of 17, scoring over 20 points a game, getting over 4 assists a game, and he looked like he belonged. And he looked like he belonged against OKC, the current NBA champions, who were playing, I believe, Lou Dort. I can double check, but they were playing Lou Dort and Alex Caruso at the time. So you can't really, Lou Dort was playing, Shea was playing, Chet was playing, Jay Will was playing, Jason Wallace was playing, Caruso was playing. So you can't really look at that game and say, oh, he was playing OKC third stringers. No, he was playing, the starting lineup of the current NBA champions, and he went off, right? So if we're going to talk about small sample sizes, I can just oppose like what was a 2-game sample size in summer league against scrubs with what is a 2-game sample size when he played starters minutes, which is 30 plus, against the best team in the league and a pretty decent, first round playoff team in the Clippers, where he looked like he belonged and he looked like one of the brightest prospects out of his draft class, which is something that I'll throw as an aside. Even if, knock on wood, Reed doesn't pan out, it's not looking like there were much better choices at his pick anyways, because that draft class is just awful. And I'm not gonna get into my thoughts on Stephon Castle because I don't want to anger Spurs fans. But this to say, if we're cherry picking 2-game sample sizes, I'd rather cherry pick the sample size where he played really well against real NBA teams. So there's not really much predictive value going forward from either of these 2-game sample sizes, because that's what truly matters to us. Will he be a playable playoff guy come the postseason?
Yeah, for me, both of the summer league games, it's a small sample, but I do think it's a fair representation of Reed as a player. At least it's a good microcosm, because I think the constant in Reed's game to this point is that there's a lot of volatility. And in both of those games, Reed started off really slow, and then he picked it up as the game moved along. That first game against the Clippers, you teased to it, he had that ridiculous stretch where he had like 9 points on 3 deep threes, and I want to say 90 seconds at the end of the third quarter. And he also had some big-time steals and blocks in that second half defensively that started fast breaks, and they almost came back and won that game. And then against Detroit, it was kind of similar. There was an awful stretch to start the game. Then he had a good stretch in the second quarter, and I believe at the half, his numbers were pretty decent. Then he had a bad run in the third quarter, and with the Pistons up big, and I think his calf was cramping up again, they just said, screw it, and he mostly didn't play in the fourth quarter. And then the overall numbers were pretty bad because unlike the Clippers game, he didn't have that turbonuclear stretch that gave them a bump. And the larger point that I'm trying to make here is that right now, the nature of his game, both the strengths and the weaknesses, the size, you mentioned it, the lack of lateral quickness, he tends to be very boom or bust in that he can definitely boom if the threes are going in at high volume and he's forcing a lot of turnovers. But the bust scenarios are when he's just too small, he's not moving well enough. And so it takes a larger sample oftentimes for those things to even out. And then if you have one of those turbonuclear stretches, like he did against the Clippers, he's one of those guys where you look at the box score and it doesn't feel like he's dominated a game. But if all of a sudden, he gets on one of those heaters and he's shooting 40% on threes at high volume, and he's also got like 8 stocks, i.e. steals and blocks, I mean, he's probably going to be a net positive player overall. Like, let's use that Clippers game as a blueprint. He took 15 threes and made 40% of them 6. That's 18 points right there before we even consider 2-pointers and free throws and assists and other things he does offensively. And then defensively, he's starting with at least like 7 or 8 stocks. If he's going to have 20-something, even 30-something points and 8 stocks, by and large, he's going to be a net positive player, especially when you combine it with his IQ, his court vision. I know the assist-to-turnover ratio was bad, but I do think that's one thing we can attribute largely to his teammates in Summer League and just the way he was defended and the lack of respect that any other player on the floor wearing a Rockets jersey commanded. Just based on the shooting and the stocks, if he plays enough minutes and he has one of those heaters, the box score is going to be fine. And so conceptually, I do think that that can translate to being a good player, and it sort of meshes with his draft profile. Like when he was coming out of Kentucky, we knew there were some elite strengths and also some deficiencies, or at least question marks. And the hope was always that if you lean into the elite strengths enough, then those can end up winning out. And so I think that's why you hear the Rockets all the time telling Reed to be more aggressive, talking about how they want him to feel more empowered. All of that makes sense on paper. But then where it gets tricky for me is fitting it into a smaller role, like, as you mentioned, being the backup point guard this season. Because obviously on a team trying to contend, you're not going to throw him into starters minutes without having proven a damn thing. We are well beyond that point in Houston. But I do think that the nature of his game, specifically those strengths and weaknesses, makes it tougher to fit into a smaller role. The analogy that I would make here, and I think this is fitting because we're in baseball season now, to me, he feels like a baseball hitter that's got potentially elite power, but there's also some holes in his swing. And everybody knows the power is good enough, even with those holes in the swing and lots of strikeouts. Everybody knows that the power is good enough. If he taps into it, he can be an all-star or even an MVP candidate with that type of profile.
Bryce Matthews, basically.
Could be, but I've got a better one for you. The Houston example that I was thinking of for this was actually the first few years of Jeremy Pena. Not Jeremy Pena now, because Jeremy just earned his first All-Star honors this month. But if you recall his first 3 seasons, so he came out of the box super strong as a rookie. Out in 22, he was MVP of both the LCS and the World Series. Astros won their second title. He was everybody's hero. The ball just exploded off his bat. People were blown away at how jacked he was in terms of his muscles, his raw power. I know he hasn't hit 30 home runs yet, but for a shortstop, his power is pretty elite. But the problem was he did have this deficiency that he just could not handle low and away breaking balls, especially the slider. And so other teams, pitchers, they noticed that. They leaned into it more, especially going into his second season. And then Jeremy sort of changed his approach. He adjusted back. But then the problem became, even though he got better at not flailing in the dirt at every slider, even though he did make contact more, the way he changed his approach made him way less of a power guy. So even if he didn't have the lowlights that he did early in his career, he also didn't have the same highlights. Now, thankfully, in 25, he's been able to put it all together at the same time. And now we should acknowledge he's been out for the past month with a broken rib, but he's going to start in AAA this week. So it sounds like he's on the way back. And thankfully, my God, the Astros need him because they are walking wounded at the moment, having just gotten swept at home by the A's. The AL West lead, as our recording time, is just 4 games. But to get back to Reed, I think in time, the hope is that maybe he can like keep the highs and also improve the deficiencies like Pena did. Basically, keep the same high ceiling, but raise the floor. But I doubt that's going to happen in year two, 21 years old, just 2 months removed from whatever we saw at Summer League. I think right now, the odds unlikely scenario is he's still going to be fairly boom or bust, and you just need to lean into those strengths as much as you can. But it's difficult with the smaller role because, like, if Reed's playing 30 plus minutes per game as a starter, like that Thunder game, like that Clippers game that you cited, Paolo, then on a lot of nights, it'll even out. And it's just like the Summer League game against the Clippers. He'll have one or two of those crazy good stretches where, before you know it, the overall box score line looks positive and everyone can argue that the good outweighs the bad. The problem becomes when you're trying to extrapolate that in a team environment to a 15 minutes per game role. Statistically, you can certainly argue that even if he shoots 1 of 8 in 15 minutes one night, well, he should be due to maybe shoot 6 of 8 the next night. And then by the end of the year, the numbers all even out just as they would if you're starting and playing major minutes. But that approach isn't really realistic in a team construct, especially trying to win on a contender, because if you go 1 of 8 with 4 turnovers in 15 minutes, and you're also getting blown by on defense because you're trying to gamble too much, and you end up losing by 4 points, it's going to feel like you cost your team the game. And veteran players, coaches, i.e. Kevin Durant, Ime Udoka, they're going to get grumpy sometimes. They're not just going to say, keep firing away, you'll get them next time. They'll say, or at least hint at, some variation of, hey, it's not your night. Why don't you give somebody else a try? That's human nature. And next thing you know, a young player ends up getting tentative and passive. And we've seen this time after time in the NBA. And I think at times it's what we saw from Reed as a rookie. In the games where he had a lot of runway, when he had the opportunity to play 30 plus minutes per game, he wasn't looking over his shoulder. He played his game. He trusted that the sample would normalize. He wasn't afraid of making mistakes. And if he made his first few shots, he'd play free and loose. But if it was a game where he was on a tight leash and the first few shots didn't go in, or he had a couple of mistakes defensively, it feels like, at least to me, that he becomes less aggressive. He doesn't want to be the reason his team loses. And that's just human nature. To go back to the baseball analogy, with high strikeout hitters, what you often see is that in these high pressure situations, they'll change their approach. Like they choke up on the bat more. They try and avoid these embarrassing strikeouts where they flail in the dirt. Nobody wants to see that if the game is on the line. They want to at least put the ball in play. But the problem is that when you do that, many times they're taken away from what should be their biggest strength. And so to maximize their skill set, you want them to feel empowered and lean into what actually makes them elite in the first place. And so that's where I think the Rockets are at with Reed in a basketball construct. To me, the best thing they can do, and we'll take the baseball analogy full circle here, let him hit some singles. Find some plays, some sets that he likes, and lean into them, especially early in games, early in the season, first halves when it's lower leverage. Maybe it's having Steven Adams set screens. We know how elite he is at that. Maybe it's the two-man game with Kevin Durant, who brings an insane amount of gravity. I know technically Reed and Steven played on the same second unit last season, but it was very early on when Reed was in the rotation, and Steven was just a shell of himself physically coming off the knee surgery. He should be much healthier this year. But to me, the bottom line in this long-winded analogy is that if you can make sure that Reed is at least getting some singles, I think he's going to have a much better shot at being in the right headspace to still swing for the fences and make those home run plays. Because right now, he needs those home run plays for his formula to work. In time, I think you can hope for the deficiencies to be improved. I don't think that's going to happen in the next 2 to 3 months. So I think what the Rockets need is for him to be the best version of himself that he can be, to try and maximize those clear skills and still hit a few home runs in a way that last year it felt like, unless he played 30 minutes per game, he just wasn't playing nearly freely enough for that to happen. In my opinion, what Summer League showed you is that those deficiencies, while not necessarily crippling, they are still there, at least for the time being. And so he needs those home runs. He needs those turbonuclear stretches to offset that. And so I think a big key is going to be making sure he's getting at least some positive feedback, some positive reinforcement, so that he doesn't just drift back into the mindset of don't make a big mistake. And I'll close the loop by making one more analogy. We'll go all 3 major U.S. sports here, because I've got a football one for you. Texans recently opened training camp this week. Reed's not going to be this good this season if he's strictly in game manager mode and he's not challenging defenses at every level. He needs some completions. He needs some first downs. He needs to see some things go right and to build confidence so that he's still in the right headspace to keep pushing for those home run plays that he needs right now to actually be a positive player. So that's my long-winded view of where things go from here. Paolo, what do you think about that analogy and my general take of Reed Sheppard as the Jeremy Pena of the Rockets? If you want to extend this analogy, Reed Sheppard as 2026 NBA Finals MVP.
I mean, I think there's an easier analogy. And we had that guy for the last few seasons, and that guy was Jalen Green.
Fair.
Guy that was really boom or bust. He had a really great playoff game and then 5 games where he sucked. I mean, I don't want to keep bringing the guy up, but I think that's it. And I think that kind of guy is okay if he's coming off the bench in a position where you can see if he's got it going, and he's got it going, you keep playing him. If he doesn't, you bench him. It's harder to have a guy like that in the starting lineup, but that's not the position Reed's in. And so that's an easier problem to solve if it ever becomes a problem. I think the Rockets didn't really do that great of a job putting themselves in a position where Reed can fail. But I guess if you count a man as the second point guard, that's Jalen role, obviously, and you count Aaron Holiday as, the third point guard, the fourth one if Reed's not playing well, then I guess that's all right when you also consider that Kevin Durant is a lead ball handler if need be. I think they'll be fine. I think there's also a world in which they bring in a buyout guy in the buyout market, later into the season because to fill that 15th spot that they can fill right now. So I think all in all, they'll be fine. I think the discussion will eventually be if it doesn't pan out, at which point should the Rockets have moved on from it, right? If this doesn't pan out, obviously, if he becomes a great player, then thank God they didn't. But I think it will be an interesting conversation, as the season progresses, because obviously with draft picks, obviously they're at their peak value before being drafted, and then they obviously, depending on their performance, they either go down in value or up in value. And I wonder where we are currently in the spectrum for Reed, if this is the highest his value will be within the next 3 years, or if this is, lower than what it will eventually be. But all in all, when you look at this team going forward, if you want to do the contending thing while also retaining upside, I think retaining Reed is part of what gives you that upside, right? Because I think when you look at Reed and what the best version of him could be, maybe you're looking at a guy like Steve Nash, or maybe you're looking at a guy like, I don't know, Peyton Pritchard is what people were talking about, obviously as a middle term somewhere in there. But obviously, as I said, if you want to retain that upside, you got to run some risk of playing guys through mistakes. And when you do that in a team with high expectations, those guys are going to either sink or swim. And let's hope Reed swims. But as you said, Summer League was not that great of a showing. But thankfully, by design, the Rockets have put themselves in a position where they have to give Reed a chance, whether they like it or not. And so there won't be Cam Whitmore type arguments because Reed will get his chance, whether Udoka likes it or not. He doesn't have really anybody else that he can play there. So yeah, we'll see how it goes.
Well, and one distinction I would make between Reed and Jalen is that at least on paper, Reed has more potential to provide off-ball value as an elite shooter. Now, he's got to do it, but there's a lot of data to suggest going into his NBA career that Reed was a generational shooting prospect. That was the one skill that everybody thought would translate. Now, it was the entirety of his game. Would he be able to put shooting and playmaking and everything together, even in a relatively undersized package, the way Steph Curry did 15 years ago? That's maybe pie in the sky, but that's obviously a super high-end outcome. And then, worst case, he should at least shoot threes at a very high level. And that's something where, relative to Jalen almost had to have the ball in his hands a lot for his model to hit at the highest level. And that was, in many ways, the problem. With Reed, there is a world where even if some of the high-end outcomes don't hit, he does still provide value as a guy who can basically be a bench shooter. And especially if he makes a few plays defensively, can get you the stocks without being burned as much, can be a net positive player, even if he doesn't come around as a star offensively by putting the entire package together. Time will tell on that, but I do think that's one small distinction with or between Jalen and Reed that I think is important, especially going into a season where Reed's going to come off the bench and have something of a complementary role. And I think it's important to emphasize that because one thing that I do believe has gotten lost, and it's going to be a little bit different relative to last season, the reps for Reed might not be quite as high leverage as some have hyped them up to be. And maybe that's going to simplify the game for him as well, especially compared to Summer League, where he was clearly option 1A on the scouting report for everybody that was trying to defend the Rockets. I'm going to quote Danielle Lerner of the Chronicle, who wrote this a few days ago in her story about the Rockets signing Josh Okogie. Keep in mind, Okogie was the last minimum contract that the Rockets could give out before being right up against the first apron hard cap, which is where they're at now. So I do think there's clearly some strategy to that signing. Here's what Danielle wrote about it. The Rockets' decision to sign another wing, a position at which they already possess considerable depth rather than a guard, appears to signal confidence in the main ball-handling trio of Fred VanVleet, Amen Thompson, and Reed Sheppard, supplemented by veteran combo guard Aaron Holiday. Those are Danielle's comments. She listed Amen second. Paolo, you mentioned Amen in this capacity earlier, and as for me, I've honestly heard a lot of the same things. After the Okogie deal leaked, I texted someone in the front office and asked what they thought about the anxiety from fans who were surprised they didn't go after a ball handler. His response to me was, hey, we already have 4 point guards. How many do we need? And yeah, the fourth is in reference to Amen Thompson. I think, at least on social media, everybody thinks it's Fred, Reed, and Aaron because that's what shows up on the depth charts. But we all know Amen has point guard skills. That was a huge part of his draft profile 2 years ago. And even though the Rockets aren't as big as some teams are when it comes to putting precise positional labels on their players, I do think they believe in the general principles of certain skill sets and what you need in order to have a complete team and a championship contender. And in this case, I don't think them putting them in that tier is lip service. I don't think it's just them PR spinning it after the fact and trying to rationalize it as being the best path simply because it happens to be the one that was available to them. No, I think they genuinely believe that he can and will function in this way, and that might simplify Reed's role as well. Another thing that I learned this summer, and I think I mentioned this in one of our recent pods, can't remember, but I heard during and right after the KD trade talks, one reason the Rockets were open to including Jalen Green in that deal, besides the obvious of salary and the fact that it's Kevin F. and Durant, was that they needed to open up more on-ball reps for Amen Thompson. And I think going back to last year, what people forget, the second point guard after Fred VanVleet, when everybody was healthy, it wasn't Reed Sheppard, and it also wasn't Aaron Holiday. It was Jalen Green. When everybody was healthy, Ime Udoka's clear preference was basically to stagger Fred and Jalen to where at least one of them was out there for all 48 minutes. You had one of them as the lead guard. And the data actually showed the Rockets were at their best when it was one of them, either Fred or Jalen, and then 4 front court players. There were games in the playoffs where Aaron Holiday, who technically was the backup point guard on paper, barely played at all. And so what the data showed was that not only did Jalen operate as the point guard when Fred wasn't on the floor, but the Rockets functioned well as a team with Jalen in that role. So conceptually, the role seems to be fine. It's not like they need a super traditional point guard. And for all the criticism that Jalen took last season, they did need him to generate advantages off the dribble and to collapse defenses at times. He's one of the only players the Rockets had that could do that on the perimeter off the dribble. It's just that moving forward, the Rockets think Amen has an even higher ceiling when it comes to doing those types of things. And maybe he wasn't quite ready to take on that level of on-ball responsibility in year 2. But I think clearly they think he will be in year 3, and especially the years beyond that, as he refines his handle, gets better making reads, all those types of developmental things. And sure, KD will have his share of on-ball touches as well, but I think KD is much more comfortable off the ball and better as a floor spacer than Jalen ever was or likely will be. And so that's not to say there won't be a role for Reed or even Aaron Holiday. Again, shooting's always important. There's also going to be games where you need smaller guys who are a little bit shiftier. And ideally, you can also function with more than one ball handler at a given time. The Rockets couldn't make it work that well last year when it was Fred, Jalen, and 3 front court players. But hey, if it's a better shooter that can function better off ball than Jalen, maybe you can have 2 ball handlers and you can have, Amen and Reed or Fred and Reed. Time will tell. But I think for now, the way the Rockets are looking at this is that when healthy, Fred and Amen are going to be your 2 primary engines. They're going to be somewhat staggered. And then basically every minute, meaningful minute that is, with your team healthy, is going to have at least one of them on the floor as the so-called lead guard. And so when you look at it that way, while there are certainly minutes for somebody like Reed, the overall importance might go down a tick. And then from there, I think the idea is that if the game is simplified, it might make it easier for Reed to not be overextended and thus to do what I was just describing and play to his strengths more. So my question for you, Paolo, are you more comfortable with Reed if you frame it in that way? Basically, the idea that it's Fred and Amen who primarily have the keys to the car, and then what you're looking for from Reed, at least in year 2, is something that's a little more supplemental, i.e. he's not really having to be the engine in his minutes.
The pessimistic side of me, after looking at it that way, tells me that by the end of the first third of the season, we'll just be playing more minutes of Dorian Finney-Smith and Tyrese, and we won't play Reed, and we'll just play Amen and Fred as the full-time point guards. Which, now that I think about it, obviously those who follow me on Twitter know that I have a little obsession over trying to make the rotations work with all the pieces that we have. So if you don't play Reed, then it all makes a lot more sense, because you just play Amen and Fred the full-time point guards, and then you stagger their minutes, and then you move either Tari or Dorian Finney-Smith to the 2, or even KD in some situations. And obviously it's that same formula of one lead ball handler guard and a bunch of wings. So it really doesn't mean much if you're playing the 2 other than you got to guard 2s, which a lot of our wings can do. But obviously it's less responsibility on Reed. But now it makes me question my previous statement just a few minutes ago where I said, sink or swim, he's going to play anyway. Well, maybe not in that situation. Obviously, injuries will still happen, knock on wood, but it's just a certainty of an NBA season. And so there will be points of the season where we have to play him, which is good because we want to see what he can do. As far as responsibility, I'm not sure it applies that way, simply because he seems to play better when he's got everything in his plate, right? He doesn't seem to be a guy that works better in a smaller role. And I think that was part of the problem for his rookie season, was that perhaps he didn't have enough volume to be fully comfortable. And so I'm not sure if having Amen and Fred kind of playing Jalen and Fred roles, ball handling wise, will be that much better for his development. Well, I guess the trend that we had last season continues.
Well, I guess the question becomes, does he simply need shot attempts or does he need touches? Because when I was saying simplified role, I meant in terms of him being the full-blown floor general who's orchestrating your offense. I wasn't talking about him necessarily shooting less, but functioning a little bit more in an off-ball capacity. And Garrett Jackson talked about that leading up to Summer League, that the Rockets wanted to work him in both on ball and off because of how he could be used next season. So I guess that's the question. I do think that he could get the same shot attempts, but then the question becomes, can he shoot at an elite level if he's functioning more off ball, or does he need to dribble into his shots? If he needs to dribble into his shots, then yeah, you might need to use him as a point guard more, and that becomes an issue.
Yeah, I'm afraid that was what I was referring to. I think he needs more touches. I think him in an off-ball role, we saw happen a little bit last season. Him as the lead, ball handler, I think the biggest difference. Because when you look at the games where he played well, he was that lead ball handler. Yeah, so I think it's more about maybe he needs to feel the ball a little bit more than those guys. Because there's obviously the types of guys who barely need to touch it; they just need to get shots off. I agree with you, but I think Reed fits more in the other category.
Fair. I do think he would benefit from watching a lot of Lou Williams tape. I think seeing how Lou used a somewhat similar package to do things off the ball, I think potentially would play well with Reed's skill set. But yeah, he could be one of those guys, we'll see, who just needs a lot of touches to get comfortable and get in the flow and doesn't work as well as, a microwave type that is super plug and play. I think it's hard to tell with the sample that we've had so far, and it's a little bit of sort of chicken or the egg, because maybe it's not the fact that he's touching the ball so much. Maybe it's that he's not flanked by as many guys where his place in the pecking order is in question. Maybe there's more role clarity in those settings last year where he played 30 plus games, and maybe if he has role, or 30 plus minutes, and maybe if he has role clarity, even if it's more of an off ball capacity, that can translate this year. But we'll see. It's certainly possible that he turns into a guy who needs to play at point guard to simply get the most out of his skill sets, because he shoots better the more he touches the ball. Even if it's a small sample, to this point, that has certainly been the case. Anyway, before we wind down the pod, let's run through the other transactions. You made a good point about, well, if Reed isn't operating on the ball, then is it a lock that he's going to play? And that's where I think the Josh Okogie signing is sort of interesting, because, look, he's a 6'5" guy with a super long wingspan, great offensive rebounder. It's ridiculous how many offensive rebounders the Rockets have now. There's a clear Ime Udoka type of player, and I guess we should have looked into Josh Okogie more, because in some ways he's sort of like a backcourt version of Jae'Sean Tate. And so if Reed is operating off the ball, especially if he's maybe a good but not elite shooter from three, Okogie actually shot a career best 35% from three last year. So yeah, there could be matchups where if Reed's not really used as a point guard, where they say, you know what, screw it, we want the additional height and defensive versatility of a guy like Okogie versus Reed Sheppard, who clearly is mostly limited defensively at this point. He is going to put up stocks, but he's fairly limited on a possession-to-possession basis. So someone that, generally speaking, the other four defenders will need to help against. So I think Okogie is an interesting signing in that construct. I think you can debate whether it's good or bad, because even if it's good for winning in a given game, long-term, there's the developmental component. And so I don't think you want to end this season with Reed being where he is now. You want to feel like he's taken a step forward. So there's a lot to balance here. But in terms of winning games, and especially as you get to maybe high-leverage playoff games, it's a good tool for Ime Udoka to have in his bag. So I should have looked at it more, because when I dig into the background, I see the career shooting year last year. And by the way, there's also a connection between Okogie and Kevin Durant, who played together with the Suns. Yeah, it actually makes a lot of sense for Okogie being an Ime Udoka culture guy, a Kevin Durant culture guy, and someone that fits exactly as a plug-and-play option in much the same way that Jae'Sean Tate did last year. Someone that's certainly not going to play every game, will get a few DNP CDs, but also someone with a very high floor that you can call on in a pinch and will definitely know what they're doing. So I think that's an interesting signing. And then you mentioned earlier the two G League guys, J.D. Davison from the Celtics and Isaiah Crawford from the Kings. I'm really intrigued by Davison just because I think his skill set is a good contrast relative to Reed. So the Rockets are listing Davison at 6'3", 215 pounds. So he's a bit bigger and thicker. And if you watch his highlights, his athleticism, it pops. Now, clearly he's proven he can play at the G League level. He just won MVP. He hasn't done much in the NBA, but he also hasn't had an opportunity. So I don't think that's a knock against him. The Celtics the last few years have been stacked. And the only reason that they had to let him go this offseason was to get underneath the second apron. So he hasn't gotten a real NBA look yet, but for a guy that's put up numbers, 25 plus points, 7 plus assists per game on reasonable efficiency at the G League level, he's an interesting bet. And now he's on a two-way with the Rockets. The other day I did a story at Rockets Wire recapping what Davison's teammates with the Celtics had said about him last season. And Paolo, some of these were really intriguing. I'm going to read you a few of those. Jaylen Brown, perennial all-star, said of Davison, "You could tell he took it to another level in training camp. I think he's been able to learn from our guys going against Peyton Pritchard, Drew Holiday, Derek White. He's gotten so much better, and that's credit to him. He's developed at a high rate." Then Al Horford, this is really good. JD is a really good passer, and he has a good feel for the game, especially when he's playing pick and roll. He's a real guard. He's able to kind of manipulate the defense, and then his ability to get to the basket, he's really explosive. Horford went on to tell Celtics blog, that's the SB Nation affiliate, that did this story on what J.D. Davidson's teammates think of him. Horford said he views Davidson's most NBA-ready skills right now as his playmaking and ability to get to the rim. Then you have Derek White. J.D. is probably our best lob thrower. Just the way he manipulates the defense. Note that this is the second guy who complements J.D.'s ability to manipulate the defense. To read the full quote, the way he manipulates the defense in the pick and roll, it's really high level. Playing against him a lot in training camp, he was a hard guard. Then Drew Holiday, he's so comfortable, he fits right in. He's definitely going to be a really good NBA player. And so to me, that's a good change-up to have relative to Reed Sheppard because, look, I know there's still Aaron Holiday, and he's got merits as a 3-and-D piece, but ideally, I think you'd prefer a younger player in that role with a bit more upside. And so if it turns out, for whatever reason, that Reed just isn't big or physical enough, or if he needs more seasoning, whatever the case may be, okay, then here's another young guy at the exact same position, entering his 4th season, Reed in year 2, Davison in year 4, who just happens to have a different skill set that might be more conducive to certain matchups. For me, the more I dig into it, it feels like a really nice hedge to have as the Rockets get closer to training camp. And we should also note that he's got experience playing with Jabari. I believe Davison and Jabari were AAU teammates before Jabari went to Auburn and then Davison went to Alabama, same part of the country. Now, with all that said, I still think the very likely and odds-on favored scenario is that Reed is ready for the rotation job and he wins it. There's a reason they drafted him number 3 overall. They have a lot invested in him. They do believe in him. The hype is real. But it is nice to have backup plans. It's nice to have an alternative. And as I see it, to take the pod full circle, J.D. Davison feels like a pretty good one at a spot where the Rockets do at least have some questions. Like, we hope Reed works out. He can work out. But let's not act like it's a certainty. And so to have someone like Davison as a hedge that's played well at the G League level and has gotten rave reviews from teammates who have proven it and won at the highest level, it's not nothing. There's something there, and he's a young guy with upside. So to have those two guys going up against each other in practice and training camp on a regular basis with contrasting skill sets, each potentially vying for some of the same minutes, I think Reed is definitely the odds-on favorite to win those minutes, but Davison can push him, and I think the combination of the two can be really interesting, and it gives Ime yet another club in the bag, to go back to that analogy. Paolo, I think that's it for me as far as the rest of the transactions. Has anything stood out to you as far as these fringe guys that Rafael Stone and Ime Udoka are bringing in as they fill out the training camp roster?
Yeah, I do think so. I'll talk about all three. I do think that Josh Okogie is different than all of the other wings that we currently have, as in he's much more of a guard defender than any of the other guys we have. Obviously, Tatari can do a job, right? The man's obviously the best on-ball defender to me in the NBA. And then, Dorian Finney-Smith can do a job, but it's not ideal anymore as he gets older. Jabari can do a job, but he's a little bit too tall. So he would be probably our second best on-ball defender on guards besides Thompson. So he does something that we, although it's a different shade of the same thing, it is a different skill set. If the shot's still there, Suns fans on social media, on Reddit, were talking about him being really streaky. We'll see. Maybe he catches fire at the right time. But for the minimum, he's a good player to have.
Let me jump in real quick as a shout out. I don't know if you remember this game, but early 2019, when James Harden was on the Unguardable tour, what Josh Okogie did in Minnesota against Harden was, and I think Okogie was a rookie at that point, was maybe the best, most brilliant individual defensive game that I've ever seen played against James Harden. Just want to give a shout out there.
Yeah. That when I hear Josh Okogie, that's still the first thing that comes up. It is me looking on Basketball Reference and thinking, this is a really, really good defender, but then looking at it as, he can't shoot. That's why he's on the Wolves. At the time, the Wolves were terrible, So Okogie does fill a need, and if you're talking about the Rockets as having 4-point guards, then I guess that makes sense. To bring up about Okogie, besides the offensive rebounding, which he's awesome at, he's also a 4.8 steals per 100 possessions guy last season, which is insane. I think he led the league in like the efficiency, like the relation between his steals and the minutes that he played. Like, to talk about real in-game minutes, he averaged 1.2 steals a game playing 15 minutes a night. If you average that up to 30 minutes a night, he'd be averaging 2.4 steals a game, which would be insane and probably league leading in most seasons besides the one where Dyson Daniels went insane. So beyond that, talking about the other two guys, Davison, listen, I think we've been through this enough times to see that small guards really struggle in the league. The Rockets have him at 6'3", Basketball Reference has him at 6'1", and then when you combine, small guard but also can't shoot, it gets even tougher. But I do like him, and as an overarching point, I will say I have no idea how the Rockets managed to get to what is the G League MVP from last season, and Isaiah Crawford, while getting into who I think should probably have gotten a real NBA contract. I have no idea how the Rockets managed to grab those two guys on two ways on a team that's already as deep as the Rockets are, where they are so kind of not really, probably a lot less likely to see real minutes than they would probably be in other teams. So I have no clue how the Rockets got these guys. Maybe they were, the first ones to come to them, and so they would rather lock in a two-way deal than wait for something better. But amazing job at getting these guys on two-way deals. I have no idea how they did. I do wonder if they'll waive Kevon Harris for probably Dante, but that's another story. So I think Davison, it's as I said, he can have the most glowing reviews from teammates, and if he has that rare talent of manipulating defenses and all of those, really kind of small advantages that you can create with the way you angle your body and in the movements of your eyes, if he has that side of being a point guard nailed down, that's rare, and maybe that becomes something. But it's just tough when you're 6'1" and you're not a great 3-point shooter. But then beyond that, the guy I really want to talk about is Isaiah Crawford, who I have no idea, first of all, how he's a Rocket with all the wins that we have, and how he's not getting minimum contracts from any of these rebuilding teams. He is, and I'll bring it up just so I don't say something wrong, but he is a 6'6", 7'1" wingspan, 23-year-old small forward who won Defensive Player of the Year in college. He's an incredible defender, incredibly lengthy. He shot 41% from three, both in college and then in the G League. And there's how is this guy not getting and then you watch him play, and there's a lot more to his game than just being a 3-and-D wing. He's not a Robert Covington type in the sense that, he can play defense, he can shoot threes kinda, and he can't do anything else. No, he's got a little wiggle to his game. He's got a nice handle, can, generate his own shot, limited, but still, when you're shooting 50-40 or close to 50-40-90 splits, you can't be taking too many bad shots. And so he strikes me as the exact type of player that we've seen the Thunder use to fuel them going into contention, which is you get him on a two-way. He's eligible for a two-way this season. He's eligible for a two-way next season. And when you're a two-way contract, you're restricted, right? So by default, you're restricted. So if the Rockets have him on a two-way this year, they can have him on a two-way next year. And after that, he'll still be restricted. And they can probably offer him a typical, the Hinkie special 4-year or 3-year, depending on how the MLEs work nowadays, minimum contract. Kind of like the Boston Celtics have with my guy, Nehemiah Skata, who has been a contributor for them and will be probably their starting center or backup or first guy off the bench this season, in which you're going to get a guy that can contribute for a really cheap deal when you have to start paying your guys real money. And 2-way this year, 2-way next year, he'll be a minimum contract by the time Amen Thompson is making max money, which is the time where you're probably not going to be in a situation where you can have the luxury of having the Dorian Finney-Smiths of the world, the Stephen Adamses of the world. So KD comes off the books as well. When you start paying, $40 million for Sengun, $40 million for Amen, $25 million for Jabari, $20 million for Tari Eason, and at that point where you really can gain a huge advantage from having a contributor on a minimum deal, I know this is a lot of projecting for what is just a two-way guy right now, but I go on YouTube, watch him play, check his stats, check his measurables, watch the way he moves, watch the way he's even a shot blocker. He's got everything. And I have no idea how this guy's a 2. I have no idea how I didn't know about this guy before. He was protected by Sam Vecini as the 62nd best prospect in his draft. And I just don't know how. Maybe it's because of the perceived lack of upside, but he strikes me as the exact type of player that makes the contending teams stick as they start paying a certain amount of money to their stars. Maybe an overreaction, but from what I've been able to dig up on him, he seems like the perfect type of guy. When I say this, I talk about, I said, Mosquito, on the Thunder, you have Aaron Wiggins, you have Kenrich Williams, you have Isaiah Joe, you have all of these guys that, nobody really heard of, or they were second-round picks or late first-round picks or undrafted guys that, the Thunder brought along, and eventually they become cheap key pieces on one of the deepest teams in the NBA. And I do think that Isaiah Crawford is going to eventually be one of those guys. And I just hope that in a couple of years, I'm clipping back this spot to show everybody that I believe on him.
You call
this day one. Yeah. I do think that he's got real potential to be that.
Yeah, and to offer a quick rebuttal on Davison, the reason that even while certainly the deck is stacked against him as a smallish guard, the reason I'm sort of intrigued by it is that the Rockets are already going to be having a lot of infrastructure in place to accommodate a small guard based on making plans for Reed Sheppard to be in their rotation. So it's the combination of those two guys and having another guy with, I don't want to say similar upside because certainly Reed should have more, but another young guy with upside, let's put it that way, when you're already planning to play a smallish point guard. I do think that some of the difficulties in a small guard making it in the NBA might be a little bit less so here when obviously you're starting Fred VanVleet and you're bringing or planning to bring Reed Sheppard off the bench. So I think just having the ready-made infrastructure and already having a plan for, how you defend at a high level with a player like that on the floor, the fact that the Rockets are already making plans for some of that could give him a little bit better chance. I'm not saying they're going to give him a serious look in training camp for a rotation spot. There'd have to be injuries or a lot of things going wrong for Reed not to at least get a look to open the season. But I do think it's nice to have in reserve in case things for one reason or another don't work out as you hope they will. As far as the two ways, and I'll wind down the pod here, but one thing I want to underscore, the Rockets may have benefited from Summer League going as poorly as it did because it made clear that they have a lot to offer in terms of reps at the G League. And so whenever a two-way guy, is signing, they have to think about the G League first, because in almost any situation they could walk into, the most likely outcome, at least to start the year, is in the G League. There might be a path to NBA minutes at some point, but it's hard to project, and injuries have a lot to do with it. I think the one thing that's within their control is, hey, I can go in here, have a strong training camp, play well in the G League, and either turn heads with this organization or turn heads elsewhere around the league so that I'm viewed as a guy who could be next up for a rotation spot. If not here, then somewhere else. It comes down to actually putting and stacking good tape, good games together. And so the fact that the Rockets have sort of graduated most of their G League guys in recent years in terms of bringing them to the NBA level, some have aged out, some have gotten traded, but just this cycle from going from rebuild to contender, the fact that, and the Summer League roster and performance largely reflected it, that the G League version of the Rockets, the Vipers, doesn't have nearly the established guys that they did a few years ago when they were getting to the finals regularly. I think that could be tempting to someone who has a few options, but the Rockets are one where it's a good organization overall. The Rockets are very well regarded around the league in terms of player development and how ahead of the curve they are in terms of their principles, analytics. They invest well, all those factors. But beyond that, I just think there's opportunity. As bad as Summer League was to watch at times, and I agree with you, Paolo, it was tough to watch those games without Reed. At the same time, that's also an opportunity. And so that could have been, the tipping point, because I think for someone like certainly Crawford, maybe Davison, although you can argue that Davison going into year 4 and already being MVP, he might be a little bit closer to, making a strong push for NBA playing time in the right circumstance. But someone that's as young as Crawford is, just 1 year removed from going undrafted, he needs to put together good tape. He needs to stack good games. And so the Vipers, as currently constructed, could be a pretty good opportunity for him. Last point on the end of the roster before we actually do close up shop. So the two-way guys get hyped up in the media, and a lot of that's because players and agents like the status, because obviously it can translate to the regular season. But at this point, and this is something that I've heard in my conversations with the Rockets, it's important to remember that Exhibit 10s and two-ways in the offseason are basically the same thing because there's no financial commitment yet. So it's basically your two-ways and your guys on Exhibit 10s. They have one at the moment in Cameron Matthews, undrafted forward out of Mississippi State, who needs to develop as a shooter. He played a little bit at Summer League. They have a couple more Exhibit 10s they can hand out. You can bring up to like 21 players training camp. I think they're at 18 or 19 now. If one of those Exhibit 10s turns out to be better than one of your two-ways, you can let a current two-way go. Your three two-ways at present are Kevon Harris, J.D. Davison, and Isaiah Crawford, and convert one of your Exhibit 10s by the time the regular season starts. Or you can make some of these signings with an eye on having them on the Vipers and obtaining their G League rights, as you can do for 3 or 4 guys every year. There's multiple motivations, but the one thing the Rockets are hitting home in these conversations is that two-ways, Exhibit 10s, they're all basically on the same footing, heading into training camp, heading into the preseason. I think they'll have an unofficial mini camp in September. These are all young guys that they're going to give a look to. And whoever ends up being the most impressive is going to be in position to earn those two-ways when it actually matters, which is the regular season. And I agree with you on paper, especially Davison and Crawford seem to have the most upside. Harris, to me, feels a little more unnecessary since you signed Josh Okogie. So I could see Harris's spot being freed up. Maybe there's somebody that you want to give a two-way to elsewhere in the league that you want to make a waiver claim for. There's all sorts of possibilities. Maybe you bring back N'Faly Dante, who they issued a two-way qualifying offer to. Is not currently on a two-way, I think in part because he got injured at Summer League, so he needs to rehab his ankle sprain, and we'll see what happens later in the offseason. Dante looked pretty good as a big man in his appearances with the Vipers last year. But the general point is that the two-ways, the Exhibit 10s, they're all on level footing. Those can easily be swapped out by the end of the preseason, which is when the two-ways actually start to matter, i.e. guys that can be shuttled back and forth between the NBA and G League. So it's good to add to the mix, as the Rockets did with Crawford and with Davison, and it may have helped because I think, players and agents do view the two-ways being something of a status symbol. A two-way sounds a lot better than an Exhibit 10 because eventually there is a financial component to that. But right now, it's not that significant. So I think that's why the Rockets gave out their two-ways to guys like Davison and Crawford that had some pedigree that, needed that reassurance. That's basically what the two-way is. And so that's why the Rockets sort of use those two-way spots or the leverage of them to bring in 2 guys with upside. And the G League roster is somewhat barren, so they'll have opportunities if they stick around. But I would also say watch what they do with the Exhibit 10 spots. They're not done. They're going to bring a couple more people into camp, and I think those guys will be given the same opportunity, and we'll see what happens in the first couple of weeks of October. Anyway, that's where we will wrap things for today. And if you want more content before our next show, the best place to get that is online. You can follow us on social media, me at Ben Dubose, Paolo at Paolo Elves NBA, and this show at The Logger Line, where if you go to the Logger Lines page on X, you can find our link tree that's got links to our distribution partners like Apple, YouTube, and Spotify. Be kind enough to subscribe, leave a positive review at your location of choice. We would appreciate that. And also on that same link tree, you can find links to friends, sponsors, partners of the program, USA Today's Rockets Wire, Carbach Brewing, Sports Talk 790. Hit up those links and you can enjoy their content as well. The obvious benefit to us, if we're driving traffic to friends, sponsors, partners of the program, we look good to those people and we can keep this program running as one of the most active podcasts covering Houston Rockets basketball. All right, with those plugs complete, we will adjourn it for tonight. For Paolo, I'm Ben. Thanks as always for listening, and please come back soon for another new episode of The Logger Line.